In line 3, when you distributed the negative sign across the binomial expression, the second term should be positive, not negative. That single sign error completely changes the inequality in line 5, which means the safety load bound you stated in line 8 does not hold. The structure is unstable.
Security lets anyone with a bus ticket in these days. Professor Arthur Pendleton did not even pause his laser pointer on the massive projection screen at the front of the stage. He was 64 years old, the long-standing chairman of the Global Structural Sustainability Council, and a man whose family had dictated the skyline of Illinois for 3 generations. He did not look up toward the upper balcony of the Chicago Architecture Center. He simply adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses and spoke directly into his lapel microphone, his voice echoing off the limestone walls with a cold, metallic resonance. "Let me guess," he continued, his eyes scanning the shadow of the back row with a practiced look of absolute disgust. "You are a part-time community college student who snuck away from a dishwashing station. You smell like a frantic, 4-hour CTA bus ride on a humid morning. Sit down and shut your mouth before you embarrass your entire family further in front of the real professionals." The room went dead silent. 300 people, all dressed in bespoke suits and high-end designer wear, turned their heads in a single synchronized motion to stare at the young black woman standing in the absolute last row of the upper balcony. Her name was Nia Vance. She was 25 years old, possessing a deep, rich, midnight complexion skin tone that stood out sharply against the pale limestone walls of the auditorium. She wore a heavy, faded canvas work jacket with faint gray burn marks near the cuffs, and her hair was styled in neat, tight microbraids that fell just past her shoulders. In her calloused hands, she held a battered, cheap blue notepad. A graduate student from Northwestern University, sitting in the seat next to Nia, immediately grabbed his leather briefcase, shot her a venomous look, and moved 3 full seats away toward the aisle. The entire front row, occupied by wealthy property developers and junior architects trying to earn Arthur favor, broke into a sharp, mocking laughter. Someone in the 4th row pulled out an iPhone 15 Pro Max and started filming Nia, aiming the camera directly at her face while whispering loudly to the person next to them. A prominent female interior designer in the 3rd row leaned back and adjusted her red Louis Vuitton scarf, whispering loud enough for the surrounding rows to hear, "Who let that charity hire in here without a proper security badge?" Not one person in that massive air-conditioned hall stood up for her. Not a single tenured architect or structural engineer offered a word of defense. But every single person in that room was about to learn a lesson about structural integrity and human dignity that they would never forget for the rest of their natural lives. They utterly and completely underestimated the girl from the South Side. What the laughing crowd did not know was that Nia was not holding a standard notebook, but an ancient, handwritten structural logbook from the 1920s that contained a hidden formula capable of bankrupting Pendleton family empire by nightfall. To truly understand the volatile nature of what happened next in that room, you need to look closer at the setting of this confrontation. The Chicago Architecture Center, situated right near the riverfront, was one of the most powerful and heavily guarded academic and professional institutions on the planet. Inside this glass and steel fortress, Arthur Pendleton behaved as though he legally owned the air everyone breathed. He was the chief author of the Municipal Structural Safety textbook, used in over 44 major American universities, a fellow of the American Society of Civil Engineers, and the sole gatekeeper of the $450 million Millennium Green Tower project. His grandfather was a city planner who drafted the modern grid of Chicago. His father was the dean of engineering at Northwestern. Arthur did not just earn his seat at the high table of American architecture, he inherited it as a birthright. Every autumn, the council hosted a 2-week elite symposium called the Pendleton Distinguished Structural Design and Sustainability Challenge. The entire event was named after his family, funded entirely by his family's massive steel endowment, organized exclusively by his hand-picked subordinates, and judged blindly by a panel that answered only to him. It was his private kingdom. The event brought together the top postgraduate researchers, structural engineering fellows, and visiting global design scholars from every major continent. On the final 3 days of the symposium, there was a fierce public competition consisting of 4 rounds of exponential difficulty. The chosen participants had to calculate structural load balances, wind shear distributions, and seismic dampening equations, live on a massive physical whiteboard in front of a critical audience. A panel of 3 elite judges scored each round based on absolute correctness, engineering elegance, and mathematical speed. After each grueling round, the participants with the lowest scores were ruthlessly eliminated from the roster. The ultimate winner of the competition received 2 life-changing rewards: a public commendation from the Global Structural Sustainability Council and a personal, unvetted letter of recommendation signed by Arthur Pendleton himself. For most affluent Ivy League graduates in that room, that letter was a prestigious bonus to add to their already stellar resumes. For the young black woman standing quietly in the back row of the balcony, it was the only key that could open the heavy iron doors that had been slammed in her face since she was a teenager. But Arthur Pendleton had no intention of letting an outsider touch his legacy, and the trap he had prepared for Nia was already ticking behind the scenes. To understand why Nia Vance was standing in that cold balcony, you have to look at where she came from. She was born and raised in the heart of Englewood, South Side, Chicago. It is a neighborhood that the evening news only visits when something terrible happens. Her mother, Darlene, had spent 18 long years working the graveyard shift, mopping floors and cleaning the executive offices at the University of Chicago. They lived paycheck to paycheck, frequently skipping dinner on the final week of the month just to keep the radiator clanking during the brutal Illinois winters. Nia did not learn advanced structural engineering at an elite East Coast preparatory school. She did not have private tutors or a $5,000 software license. She taught herself the complex laws of physics and materials science using discarded, water-damaged textbooks she pulled from dumpster bins behind a community center. She watched free MIT open course videos on a 7-year-old Android tablet with a deeply shattered screen. She would sit under the dim light of a single bulb in her small bedroom, watching the same fluid dynamics lectures 50 times over until the mathematical concepts stopped being confusing and started being completely obvious. She eventually earned a full academic scholarship to Howard University. She graduated top of her class with a double major in pure mathematics and structural engineering. But when she applied to doctoral programs across Illinois, every single elite university rejected her within 3 weeks. The letters were identical, polite, and vague, stating she was simply not the right institutional fit. No feedback, no explanation, just a closed door. With no other options to support her mother, Nia took a low-paying job as a certified commercial welder at a heavy metal recycling facility near the South Ship Canal. She spent her days joining massive steel beams together by hand, and her nights teaching basic algebra to kids at a local community center. She saved every spare dollar, skipping meals and walking miles to avoid transit fees. When she discovered that the Pendleton Symposium had an open enrollment clause allowing the general public to audit the lectures from the upper balcony, she did not hesitate. She bought a basic transit pass, packed a canvas backpack with 2 changes of heavy work clothes, and checked into a cheap, decaying motel 7 miles away from the riverfront. She did not come to network or mingle with the wealthy elite. She came because She knew that Arthur Pendleton's signature on a recommendation letter was the only key powerful enough to force those elite doctoral boards to look at her actual work. But from the moment her steel-toed work boots crossed the threshold of the Chicago Architecture Center, the environment made one thing undeniably clear. She was a complete outsider, and she was not welcome in their world. It was embedded in the towering oil portraits of dead white men hanging along the marble corridors, the leather seats filled with young students who greeted each other by their country club nicknames, and the deliberate way the security staff looked at her scuffed canvas backpack and immediately looked away with suspicion. On her second morning, an administrative staff member had stopped her firmly by the arm, asking if she was part of the third-party catering crew arriving to set up the coffee station. Throughout the first 2 days of the symposium, Nia remained completely silent in the highest row of the balcony, filling her cheap blue notepad with precise observations. She watched how Arthur treated the different demographics in the hall. When affluent students raised their hands, Arthur would lean forward over the podium, smile warmly, and engage them in an intellectual dialogue for 10 minutes. But when a minority visiting scholar raised their hand, Arthur would pause, clear his throat with mild annoyance, and completely rephrase their question. "Let me make your query more precise and worthwhile for the audience," Arthur would say coldly, before answering his own modified version without ever looking the student in the eye. A wealthy graduate student named Bradley Chambers sat 3 rows beneath Nia on the afternoon of the second day. He turned his head toward his classmate, speaking in a heavy whisper that easily traveled up to her row, stating that he had no idea the council started handing out public auditing passes to the local steel mills. His friend let out a quiet, condescending laugh. Nia did not flinch, nor did she lower her pen. She simply kept writing her equations, her hand perfectly steady. That night, sitting alone on the edge of her creaking bed in the distant motel, she read the official competition guidelines one final time on her cracked tablet screen. The rules clearly stated that the challenge consisted of 4 open rounds evaluated purely on structural correctness, engineering elegance, and mathematical speed. She closed the tablet and stared up at the water-stained ceiling. She had not sacrificed her savings and endured the whispers just to sit quietly in the back row while mediocre men decided her worth. But Nia had absolutely no way of knowing that the most dangerous obstacle was not the difficulty of the engineering problems themselves. The true danger lay in the elaborate trap that Arthur Pendleton had already constructed for anyone who possessed the audacity to challenge his family's absolute authority. On the third morning of the symposium, the tension in the room broke. Arthur stood at the absolute center of the front stage, a piece of white chalk held firmly in his right hand, rapidly working through a complex structural proof involving wind-load distribution dynamics for a theoretical 72-story super-tall skyscraper. His handwriting on the giant blackboard was fast, fluid, and filled with the unearned confidence of a man who had performed this exact demonstration for 20 years. The entire auditorium was dead silent, 300 people watching his hands move with uncritical admiration. But Nia was not watching him with admiration from her high seat in the balcony. She was watching his work with an intense, unblinking focus that stripped away his status and looked only at the science. Her eyes moved methodically from line 1 to line 2, finding nothing wrong. Her eyes moved from line 2 to line 3, and then her entire body went perfectly still. She tilted her head slightly to the left. She looked down at her blue notepad, her pen hovering over the paper. She looked back up at the massive board, verifying the coordinates. She checked her manual calculations one more time. In the third critical line of the wind shear equation, Arthur had distributed a negative structural sign across a complex binomial expression representing the lateral force vector. But in his haste to look brilliant, he had completely missed the second mathematical term within the brackets. The resulting sign should have been a positive reinforcement vector, not a negative one. It was a single, localized sign error, the exact kind of small clerical mistake that 99% of the students in the room would completely overlook due to the intimidating complexity of the overall proof. But Nia was not like anyone else in that room. Her mind could already see the immediate, catastrophic chain reaction caused by that single incorrect sign. That one wrong vector completely inverted the inequality boundary in line 5 of the structural proof, which caused the entire safety load bound in line 8 to completely collapse into invalid numbers. This meant that the entire architectural conclusion Arthur was presenting, the very foundational math for his $450 million tower, was fundamentally flawed and would result in an actual structural failure under high wind conditions. Nia raised her right hand high into the air. Arthur did not even glance up toward the balcony. He purposely scanned the first 3 rows of the main floor, pointed his index finger directly at Bradley Chambers, his absolute star doctoral protégé, who sat in the center of the second row, and took his prearranged question instead. Bradley asked a soft, flattering question regarding the aesthetic integration of the tower's exterior steel cross-bracing. Arthur smiled broadly, his chest swelling with pride as he answered the question with immense warmth and paternal affection, exchanging inside jokes like old friends at a golf club. Nia's hand remained perfectly high and steady in the air of the upper balcony. Arthur finally completed his sentence, and his eyes reluctantly drifted up toward the shadows of the back row. His warm smile vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, hardened mask. "Yes, the auditor from the back," Arthur said, his voice dripping with condescension. He did not use her name. He did not say young lady. He used the word auditor as a sterile, diminishing category designed to remind everyone in the room that she did not belong to their social class. Nia stood up from her seat, her voice projecting through the massive hall with absolute clarity. "Professor Pendleton, if you examine the 3rd line of your wind load proof," Arthur immediately held up a single, authoritative finger, cutting her off in mid-sentence before she could finish. "I will take questions exclusively from officially enrolled participants and certified council members first," Arthur stated, turning his back to her and facing the blackboard again. "If there happens to be an excess of time at the conclusion of the seminar, public auditors may submit their minor questions in writing to the administrative desk outside." The conversation was instantly over. The auditorium went completely quiet, but it was not the quiet of polite agreement. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, born from intense social discomfort. A few junior students in the front row turned around to exchange amused glances. Bradley Chambers smirked openly, leaning back in his leather chair. A young black woman named Maya Dawson, who was a visiting auditing student from a smaller state school sitting 2 rows beneath Nia, gripped her upholstered armrest so incredibly hard that her knuckles turned a stark, ash-white color. Maya looked up at Nia with an expression filled with deep, protective fear, a silent plea that begged her to just let it go, to sit down and drop it, because challenging a man like Pendleton in his own house was a form of professional suicide. But Nia Vance had not spent her entire life working next to industrial furnaces and fighting for a seat at the table, just to let a filthy man hide the truth behind a title. She looked at the massive blackboard. She looked at the powerful man who had just reduced her entire identity to a worthless label. She looked at the 300 faces who had already collectively decided that a dark-skinned girl from the South Side had absolutely nothing of value to contribute to their world. And with an unshakable calm, Nia Vance raised her hand into the air for the 2nd time. This time, the entire room noticed. It wasn't because they supported her, but because they were curious. It was the same way a crowd gets curious when someone walks right toward the edge of a cliff. Bradley Chambers turned around completely in his seat. The junior partners at the front table stopped talking. Even the security guards by the door shifted their weight. Arthur saw the hand. He knew the whole room was watching. If he ignored her now, it would make him look small and defensive. But if he let her speak, he figured she would just embarrass herself and prove his point once and for all. He let out a heavy sigh, the kind of sigh a man gives when he is doing a massive favor for someone who doesn't deserve it. "Fine," he said, gesturing toward the balcony. "Go ahead, make it quick." Nia stood right where she was. She didn't rush her words, and she didn't stutter. She looked directly at the massive board, took a slow breath, and opened her mouth. What she said next made every single person in that room stop breathing. In line 3, when you distributed the negative sign across the binomial expression, the second term should be positive, not negative. She paused. She didn't do it for dramatic effect. She did it to give the entire room enough time to actually look at the math on the board. That single sign error completely changes the inequality in line 5, which means the safety load bound you stated in line 8 does not hold. The structure is unstable. Then she just sat back down. That was it. 3 short sentences. No long explanation, no nervous apologies, no trailing off. She just stated exactly what she saw and reclaimed her seat. For several long seconds, the room didn't make a sound. It was the silent weight of 300 engineering brains all recalculating the exact same equation at the exact same time. Every single head turned toward the front board. Fingers traced the negative sign in line 3. Lips moved silently. One by one, the realization hit the room like a wave. She was right. The sign was completely wrong. The inequality in line 5 collapsed, and the structural safety bound in line 8 was totally invalid. The entire foundational proof that a legendary, tenured chairman had just presented with absolute certainty was built on a massive, junior-level mistake, and a 25-year-old Tho Han from the South Side had caught it in less than 2 minutes. It took the students about 10 seconds to fully realize it. It took Professor Arthur Pendleton exactly 2. He knew before anyone else did. You could see it in the way his chalk hand froze midair. You could see it in the way his jaw tightened up just a fraction of a millimeter before he slowly turned around to face his audience. But Arthur hadn't spent 40 years controlling the architecture board without learning how to protect his own skin. He forced a smile onto his face, the kind of smile that takes an immense amount of physical effort to hold up. "An interesting observation," Arthur said smoothly, his voice echoing through the microphone. "The sign is indeed reversed, a minor clerical slip. However, this does not materially affect the final structural conclusion of the tower's design. That was an absolute lie, and every single person in that room with a master's degree knew it was a lie. The sign error didn't just affect the conclusion, it tore the entire foundation of the proof apart." Arthur was simply betting that the sheer weight of his family name would outweigh the raw authority of her mathematics. For his entire life, that bet had always won. But things were starting to shift. In the front row, an independent structural auditor named Dr. Sarah Bennett opened her leather notebook and quietly started rechecking the entire proof from line 1. Then a doctoral student 2 rows behind her did the exact same thing. Even Bradley Chambers, Arthur's own golden boy, pulled out a silver pen and began working through the derivation on his pad. The sudden, silent scratching of pens on paper was the real judgment. Nobody had to say a word. The sound of 60 pens moving at once said everything. Arthur stood at the front of the stage and watched it happen. He was watching his own hand-picked circle verify that he was wrong, and that the woman he had just publicly humiliated from the balcony was entirely right. He hadn't completely lost control of the room yet, but for the first time in his long career, he could feel the ground beneath his feet beginning to slide. And at the main judging table, something even more dangerous was brewing. Dr. Marcus Vance, a visiting global design scholar from Princeton and one of the world's leading authorities on structural safety, tilted his head slightly. He looked closely at the board, then he looked up at Nia, sitting calmly in the balcony. He opened his official grading folder, took out a blank sheet of paper, and wrote 3 words down for his assistants. "Look into her." He didn't say it out loud. He didn't need to. He had seen exactly what he needed to see. During the afternoon intermission, Maya caught up with Nia in the crowded marble hallway, grabbing her firmly by the jacket sleeve. "Do you have any absolute idea what you just did in there?" Maya whispered, her eyes wide with panic. Nia looked at her calmly, adjusting the strap of her canvas backpack. "I pointed out an unstable safety vector in a public blueprint." Maya stared at her like she was losing her mind. "You didn't just point out a minor sign error, Nia. You just corrected Arthur Pendleton, in his own building, in front of his own major financial donors, in front of 300 people who look at us like we belong in the service elevator." Nia's expression didn't change, but a quiet, intense focus settled deep into her eyes. It wasn't a look of victory, it was something much more grounded. It was the realization that the heavy iron door she had been fighting against wasn't nearly as solid as she had been led to believe. When the intermission ended, the students filed back into the grand hall. The overall energy in the auditorium had completely turned. It was subtle, but it was real. People who had completely looked past Nia when she walked in were now stolen glances at her balcony seat. It wasn't warmth, not yet, but it was an intense curiosity. It was the kind of curiosity that comes over an audience when they realize they have deeply and dangerously underestimated someone. That was when Arthur made his move. He walked slowly back to the center of the stage, tapped the microphone, and made an unexpected announcement. He stated that in the spirit of open academic scholarship and true meritocracy, the upcoming Public Structural Design Challenge would be officially expanded. All registered attendees, including our public auditing guests in the balcony, are fully welcome to enter the live testing arena. He looked directly up at Nia when the words left his mouth, a warm, generous smile spreading across his face. It was the kind of smile a hunter gives right when the trap snaps shut. "After all," Arthur added, his voice dripping with false praise, "if our auditing guest from the city transit line has such a remarkably sharp eye for minor errors, I am completely certain she will find the live competitive environment highly stimulating." A few of the wealthy students in the front rows laughed under their breath. Bradley Chambers grinned openly, but Nia didn't laugh, and her face gave away absolutely nothing. She simply gave a single, firm nod from the balcony. She was in, and she had no idea that the entire competitive field had already been heavily rigged against her before she even took her place at the table. On the 5th morning of the symposium, the grand auditorium had been completely transformed into a high-stakes competitive arena. The standard rows of leather seating had been cleared from the center stage, replaced by a massive high-definition digital layout and a long mahogany judging table at the front. A towering physical whiteboard stood at the absolute center of the stage, flanked by dual projection screens. The first 2 rows of the auditorium were strictly reserved for the 12 official participants who had survived the preliminary screenings. The remaining 300 seats were packed to absolute capacity with spectators, property developers, and journalists, while latecomers stood 3 deep along the back limestone walls. For the very first time all week, Nia Vance took a seat in the front row. She stood out like a silhouette against snow. She was the only competitor without an official corporate sponsorship badge, the only public auditor, the only graduate from a historically black university, and the only person carrying a faded canvas backpack instead of a premium leather portfolio case. Out of the 12 competitors standing on that stage, 11 had been hand-picked, mentored, and funded by Arthur Pendleton's inner circle. The 12th competitor had simply been dared to show up. The rules of the challenge were simple but brutal. Each round, a highly complex structural engineering problem would appear on the projection screens. The participants were given a strict time limit to calculate the structural load balances, materials strain, and safety vectors, and then map out their full mathematical derivations live on the board. The elite judging panel scored each presentation based on 3 uncompromising criteria: structural correctness, engineering elegance, and mathematical speed. At the end of each round, the competitors with the lowest scores were ruthlessly eliminated. The final round would be a brutal, one-on-one sudden death matching. Round 1 began with a massive structural optimization problem involving dynamic wind load redistribution across an irregular, nonlinear skyscraper core. The other 11 participants immediately dove into their notebooks, setting up the standard, industry-approved algorithm known as the matrix displacement method, which was taught in every elite Ivy League graduate seminar. Bradley Chambers moved with practiced speed, his silver pen flying across his pad as he applied the familiar textbook formulas he had memorized under Arthur's guidance. Nia did not pick up her chalk for the first 30 seconds. She stood perfectly still in front of her section of the board, staring at the raw numbers. To the crowd, she looked paralyzed by fear. But Nia wasn't frozen. Her mind was looking deeper. She noticed a hidden geometric symmetry in the building's core layout that the standard textbook formulas completely ignored. The core structure possessed a variable stiffness distribution that mirrored an advanced mathematical concept known as a bipite graph network. Recognizing this symmetry meant the entire problem could be completely reframed. Instead of spending 20 minutes calculating endless matrix variables like the others, Nia converted the entire skyscraper core problem into a simplified fluid flow network equation. She stepped up to the board and began to write. Her chalk strokes were firm, rhythmic, and incredibly sparse. She wasn't building a massive web of numbers. She was carving a direct line straight to the answer. Her final solution was less than half the length of anyone else's on that stage. She placed her chalk down with a sharp click, finishing first by a massive, undeniable margin of nearly 4 minutes. Bradley Chambers finished a distant second, his derivation correct, but incredibly long and bloated. He had built a massive, expensive highway to cross a river. Nia had found a natural land bridge that no one else in the room even knew existed. The judging panel conferred quickly, and the initial scores were flashed onto the digital screens. Nia Vance received the absolute highest marks of the round, with Dr. Marcus Vance awarding her a perfect score for engineering elegance. Bradley Chambers came in second. Arthur Pendleton, sitting in the front row of the VIP section, did not join the polite applause. His face remained completely expressionless, but his jaw tightened by exactly 1 millimeter. The energy in the auditorium began to turn. The junior architects and students, who had smirked at Nia 2 days earlier, were now leaning forward in their seats, their whispers taking on a distinctly nervous tone. A few people in the middle rows pulled out their phones, but they weren't recording her to mock her this time. They were recording history. A tech-savvy graduate student in the third row typed out a rapid message and hit post. A public auditor from Howard is currently leading the Pendleton Challenge at the Chicago Architecture Center. Watch this space. Within 40 minutes, the post had been shared over 3,000 times across professional engineering networks. Between the first and second rounds, a crucial conversation took place completely hidden from the audience. Arthur Pendleton quietly approached the judges' table during the brief, technical intermission. He leaned over the counter, speaking in a low, authoritative whisper to his administrative coordinator, suggesting that the remaining competitive problems should immediately shift toward deep theoretical microstresses and advanced composite material physics. On the surface, it sounded like a reasonable request to test the student's depth. In reality, it was a coded command. It meant shifting the entire competition into highly specialized, proprietary testing software parameters that were only accessible to students who attended Arthur's private non-public research seminars at Northwestern. It was an area of study that an outsider using discarded textbooks would never have encountered. Dr. Marcus Vance noticed the sudden change in the problem syllabus, but he did not openly object. Not yet. He simply watched Arthur's movements, opened his folder, and began keeping a very careful, private record of the original technical parameters. Meanwhile, Nia was standing entirely alone in the concrete hallway outside the auditorium, quietly eating a cheap granola bar she had pulled from her canvas backpack. She had absolutely no idea that the rules of the game were being quietly reshaped behind closed doors to ensure her failure. She was simply reviewing her handwritten logbook, trying to ignore the fact that her hands were shaking slightly from sheer physical exhaustion. It wasn't fear. It was the immense, exhausting weight of being the only person in a massive institution who had to fight for the right to simply breathe the same air as everyone else. Maya Dawson found her near the water fountain, sitting down on a concrete bench next to her. Maya was quiet for a long moment, watching the corporate executives walk past them. "You know they are going to change the parameters to lock you out, right?" Maya said softly, her voice filled with heavy reality. "They aren't going to let a Tho Han from Englewood walk away with the Pendleton family crown." Nia swallowed her food, her eyes tracking a flock of birds outside the floor-to-ceiling glass windows. "I know," she said simply. Maya stared at her. "And you are still going to walk back out on that stage?" Nia adjusted the strap of her backpack and stood up straight, her midnight-complexioned face hardening into stone. "I didn't ride a crowded transit bus for 4 hours and sleep in a 6th-floor motel just to drop my chalk because a wealthy man is scared of my math. We are finishing this." Round 2 began with an entirely different kind of trap. The problem flashed onto the screens. Prove the following load-bearing stability statement for a multi-tiered cantilevered foundation under high thermal stress. The equation looked incredibly straightforward, a standard variation of classic structural theorems. Every official participant on the stage immediately picked up their chalk and began constructing a massive, methodical proof. Bradley Chambers was writing with immense confidence, his chalk sweeping across his section of the board in smooth, practiced movements. The room was silent except for the rhythmic, scratching sound of chalk against slate. Nia did not pick up her chalk. She stood perfectly still in front of her board, her arms folded across her canvas jacket, staring intensely at the statement. 90 seconds passed without her making a single mark. The crowd began to stir. People in the audience started to whisper loudly, and Bradley Chambers leaned over during a pause to catch his friend's eye, flashing a smug grin that said she had finally hit her intellectual ceiling. But Nia wasn't stuck. She was running a massive, multi-variable stress simulation entirely inside her own mind, and what she realized within those 90 seconds was something that no one else in the room, including the tenured textbook authors, had even bothered to check. The foundational statement on the screen was completely false. It was a mathematical mirage. Every other Ivy League student on that stage was wasting their limited time trying to prove a structural theorem that was fundamentally impossible to prove. They were building massive, complex roads to an architectural city that did not exist. Nia saw the flaw. She saw that if you constructed a specific, highly customized geometric counterexample using a localized cluster of only 6 specific load vertices, the entire theoretical claim completely fell apart. She picked up her piece of chalk. She drew the 6 vertices in a precise interlocking hexagonal pattern, calculated the localized stress failure point, stepped back from the board, and spoke directly into her microphone. This is a total counterexample. The foundational statement is false. The entire auditorium went dead silent. The judging panel immediately stood up from their chairs to examine her board. Dr. Marcus Vance walked up to the stage, adjusted his glasses, and traced her 6-vertex cluster with his finger, checking each thermal connection manually. After a tense minute of recalculation, he turned to the other judges and gave a firm, definitive nod. The statement was indeed a false theorem. 3 official Ivy League participants were eliminated on the spot because they had wasted their entire time trying to validate a lie. Nia Vance moved forward into the semifinals. When the official scores for round 2 were announced on the digital screens, Nia received a 91 out of 100. She frowned slightly at the screen. Knowing her counterproof was mathematically flawless, but she kept her composure and said absolutely nothing. She had no way of knowing that the score written on the panel's original grading sheet by Dr. Marcus Vance was a perfect 98. Someone had deliberately intercepted the grading sheet between the judges' table and the digital presentation booth, stealing 7 crucial points from her total to artificially keep Bradley Chambers in the lead. Round 3 pushed the remaining 4 competitors to the absolute limit of human calculation. The clock was set to a brutal 3 minutes. The problem involved finding the maximum stable load distribution within an extremely dense, irregular network of interconnected support beams. For a problem of this magnitude, 3 minutes was almost nothing. It required an assembly line of calculations. The other 3 doctoral candidates dove in instantly, working through the equations step by step using brute force algebra. Bradley Chambers was moving with terrifying speed, his pen scratching with precision as he built the answer from the ground up, testing every single combination one by one. Nia did something entirely different. Instead of analyzing the massive network of support beams directly, she closed her eyes for 3 seconds, visualized the inverse space, and drew the structural complement of the network on the board. She turned the problem inside out. Finding the largest group of stable beams in the original structure became the exact mathematical equivalent of finding the tightest cluster of high-stress failures in the inverse mirror graph. And the inverse mirror graph was 80% simpler to calculate. She identified the critical failure point visually within seconds, mapped out the definitive answer, and placed her chalk down with 42 seconds remaining on the clock. Brad Chambers finished 12 seconds before the buzzer, his face pale and covered in sweat. His answer was correct, but he had taken the longest, most exhausting path possible. Nia had simply turned the mountain upside down. 2 more doctoral candidates were immediately eliminated from the stage. The field was now down to the final 2, Nia Vance and Bradley Chambers. The semi-final pairings were announced by the coordinator, claiming to be a completely random draw. But anyone who had been paying attention to the politics of the room knew better. That evening, the story broke out of the academic bubble. The original post from round 1 had gone completely viral across major engineering networks. A prominent national architecture blog published a breaking article with a headline that captured the country's attention. Who is Nia Vance? Someone tracked down her stellar Howard University transcript and posted it online, showing her flawless academic record. An investigative journalist from the Chicago Tribune sent an urgent email to the council's press office demanding an official comment on why a top-tier scholar had been denied entry to their doctoral programs. The story was no longer just about a technical competition. It was about an entire gatekeeping system, and the world was now watching the stage. The next morning, Na walked back into the grand auditorium of the Chicago Architecture Center. The final round was scheduled to begin in 3 hours, but the room was already buzzing with intense energy. Double the number of people had shown up compared to the previous day. Word had spread like wildfire across the city. A few faces in the front rows were entirely new, including an investigative journalist from the Chicago Tribune who sat with an open notebook, pen poised. Bradley Chambers was already sitting in the front row, intensely reviewing his advanced seminar notes. He looked relaxed and confident. He had every reason to be. He had spent 3 years studying directly under Arthur Pendleton, gaining exclusive access to restricted structural research papers, at seminar materials, and experimental calculation models that were completely unavailable to anyone outside the council's inner circle. Nia had nothing but a faded canvas backpack and a cracked tablet. But she also possessed something Bradley could never buy with a tuition check. She had spent 10,000 hours entirely alone with numbers. She had spent her youth in a quiet room under a single light bulb, forcing her mind to see the physical shape of engineering problems she had never been taught. She sat down, opened her cheap blue notepad, and waited. She had solved every single problem thrown at her, but the final problem was built specifically to break her spirit. The final structural problem flashed onto the massive projection screens. Nia looked at it. Bradley looked at it. The entire room looked at it. Bradley immediately smiled. Nia did not. The problem involved calculating a highly advanced, nonlinear stress distribution bound for a reinforced foundation structure under extreme dynamic wind shear. It was elegant, incredibly intricate, and completely absent from any published textbook, research paper, or publicly available engineering manual in the country. It was a direct excerpt from Arthur Pendleton's own unpublished, private research manuscript. The highly specialized mathematical shortcut required to solve this specific equation within the time limit had only ever been taught in one exclusive location: Arthur's private, invitation-only advanced seminar at Northwestern University. Bradley Chambers had taken that exact seminar 3 months ago. He had practiced this specific shortcut dozens of times. He recognized the layout of the problem the way a musician recognizes a song they have played 100 times. Nia Vance had never seen it. She had never been allowed into the room where it was taught. She was looking at a technical question that had been hand-picked to guarantee her public failure. The competitive field had been tilted, not through an obvious rule change, but through selective problem targeting. The most elegant kind of institutional corruption, the kind that looks completely fair on paper but is entirely rotten underneath. And there was something else Nia did not know yet. Her actual score from the second round had been intentionally defaced. The judge's original grading sheet showed a near-perfect score of 98, but Arthur's administrative coordinator had altered it to a 91 before it hit the big screens, stealing 7 critical points to protect Bradley's lead. At the judging table, Dr. Marcus Vance read the final problem, and his expression hardened instantly. He recognized the equation immediately. He had reviewed Arthur's unpublished research draft 6 months earlier as part of a national peer consultation committee. He knew exactly where the problem came from, and he knew exactly what it meant for the integrity of the challenge. He quickly scribbled a note on his pad and slid it to his assistant. It read, "This is a direct lift from Pendleton's unpublished manuscript. Bring me the original physical scoring sheets from round 2 immediately." The assistant hurried out of the room. Dr. Vance didn't look back. His eyes were locked on the stage. The digital countdown clock started. 15 minutes. Bradley picked up his piece of chalk with the effortless confidence of a man who already owned the victory. Nia picked up hers with the absolute focus of a woman who knew she was walking directly into an ambush. But she stepped up to the board anyway. Bradley moved like a performer executing a routine he had thoroughly memorized. His chalk flowed across the slate in smooth, unbroken strokes, every line following the next, without a second of hesitation. He wasn't solving a problem, he was simply replaying a memory. The proprietary shortcut from Arthur's private seminar fit the problem perfectly, like a key turning in a custom lock. The audience watched him with breathless admiration. 4 minutes into the round, Bradley was already 2/3 of the way finished. Nia was barely at 1/3. She was working strictly from first principles, building her solution from the absolute ground up, brick by brick. Using only the fundamental laws of physics she had taught herself next to industrial furnaces and in a distant motel room. It wasn't fast enough. 6 minutes in, Bradley was nearing completion. Nia was only halfway through her calculations. The gap between their workboards was stark and highly visible to everyone in the hall. The whispering started up again in the middle rows. "She's finally falling behind," a junior architect murmured. It was bound to happen. You can't fake a premium education. Bradley Chambers leaned back slightly during a pause, crossing his arms with a look of immense satisfaction. Arthur Pendleton sat in his VIP leather chair, with his hands folded neatly over his cane, his face a mask of calm, patient victory. It was the expression of a craftsman watching a trap perform exactly as designed. 8 minutes in, disaster struck for Nia. Due to the intense physical exhaustion clouding her vision, she transposed 2 critical load indices in the center of her structural derivation. It was a minor clerical error, the kind that happens when your brain is running 10 times faster than your hand can move, but its consequences were devastating. She caught the mistake almost immediately, but erasing and recalculating that specific section cost her a full 60 seconds, a minute she absolutely did not have to spare. The digital clock now showed less than 4 minutes remaining. Bradley was completely finished, casually dusting white chalk from his fingers. Nia was staring at a massive board of unfinished equations. Then, something happened that had not occurred at any point during the entire week. Nia stopped writing. Her right hand dropped a few inches from the board. Her shoulders slumped slightly, and her breathing became heavy. For 3 seconds, exactly 3 seconds, she looked like a woman who was finally about to drop her chalk and walk off the stage. 300 people saw the change in her posture. Some felt a sudden wave of genuine sympathy. Others felt vindicated that the outsider had broken. Bradley Chambers almost let out a laugh. Maya Dawson, sitting in the 5th row, was gripping her seat so hard her knuckles were raw. She stopped breathing entirely, her eyes locked on Nia. Then, Nia looked up. She didn't look at her unfinished equations. She didn't look at Bradley's smug expression, and she didn't look at Arthur. She turned her head and looked directly out into the crowded audience. Somewhere in the 5th row, her eyes found Maya. Maya didn't give a dramatic nod. She didn't smile, and she didn't mouth any cliché words of encouragement. She just looked back at Nia with a steady, unblinking gaze that contained no pity and no fear. Sometimes the most powerful thing one human being can do for another is simply refuse to look away. Nia turned back to the massive whiteboard. She stared at her work for 2 seconds, and then she did something completely radical that no one in the room expected. She picked up the large eraser and completely wiped out 3 entire lines of her calculations. It wasn't a minor fix. She completely abandoned her entire initial approach. She was not going to chase Bradley's corporate shortcut, and she was not going to play a game that Arthur Pendleton had meticulously designed for her to lose. She was going to build her own path. A completely new mathematical construction began to appear on the slate. She mapped out an auxiliary stress network, a highly original structural mapping between 2 completely different material properties that no one in the room had ever seen attempted before. She wasn't following any existing textbook, and she wasn't applying any industry standard formula. She was inventing a completely new method of structural calculation in real time, under immense pressure, with 300 hostile people watching and a digital clock counting down the final seconds of her opportunity. Bradley put his chalk down officially. Done. his microphone blared. The front rows erupted into enthusiastic applause. His solution was clean, correct, and perfectly executed based on the private research he had been handed. Arthur nodded his approval from the front row. The digital clock showed only 90 seconds remaining. Nia was still writing furiously, her chalk moving faster than it had all day, leaving a trail of white dust in the air. New inequalities and stress bounds were rapidly taking shape on the slate. 60 seconds, 30 seconds. She was running out of physical space at the bottom of her board. She dropped to one knee, moving to the absolute bottom right corner of the slate, and wrote out the final definitive line of her proof. Small, compact, but perfectly legible. It was the exact calculation that completed the structural safety proof. The loud buzzer sounded through the auditorium, signaling the end of the round. But Dr. Marcus Vance had been watching her every movement from the center of the judging table, and his eyes had caught a crucial detail that the rest of the celebratory crowd had completely missed. Nia stepped back from the board, her hands covered in white chalk dust, the buzzer still ringing in the air. Arthur Pendleton stood up from his VIP seat. He walked onto the stage with the slow, measured stride of a man who had already determined the final outcome before the sun rose. He walked directly over to the whiteboard, positioning his large frame directly in front of the bottom corner where Nia had just written her final numbers, completely blocking it from the audience's view, and faced the crowd. "Time is officially up," Arthur announced into his microphone, his voice dripping with authority. "Mr. Chambers has successfully completed his structural derivation within the allotted time. Unfortunately, Miss Vance's work appears to be entirely incomplete." He gestured casually toward the board behind him. From the audience's specific angle, the main body of Nia's calculations was fully visible. The auxiliary network, the mapping, the stress inequalities, but the final, completing line she had written in the corner during the last seconds of the round was completely hidden behind Arthur's large body. The room saw what looked like an unfinished board. The coordinator immediately moved to award the round and the overall challenged trophy to Bradley Chambers. The audience broke into a polite, restrained applause. Nia stood at the absolute edge of the stage, silent still and completely unmoving. Her face remained an unreadable mask of dignity. In the fifth row, Maya Dawson had silent tears running down her face. Not because she was sad, but because the blatant unfairness of the system was suffocating, because everyone in that room had just watched a heavily rigged game produce the exact corporate outcome it was designed to manufacture. Bradley was already shaking hands with two of the junior judges at the table, and Arthur was clearing his throat to announce the closing remarks. The story, it seemed to everyone in the room, was officially over. Then Dr. Marcus Vance spoke into his central microphone. "Professor Pendleton." His voice wasn't loud, and he didn't raise his pitch. He didn't need to. It was the kind of voice that stops a room instantly, not because of its volume, but because of its absolute professional authority. 25 years at Princeton, hundreds of foundational papers on material science, a named chair in structural safety. When Marcus Vance spoke your name, you stopped moving. Arthur froze mid-stride. "Before we proceed with the official closing ceremony," Dr. Vance said calmly, "I would like to personally step up and examine Miss Vance's board." Arthur blinked behind his gold-rimmed glasses, his smile faltering for a fraction of a second. "The solution is clearly incomplete, Dr. Vance. We all saw the clock expire before she could finish the upper lines." "Humor me," Dr. Vance responded, his voice flat and unyielding. 2 short words. The entire auditorium went completely silent. It wasn't the uncomfortable social silence from earlier in the week. It was a breathless, high-voltage silence. It was the kind of silence where 300 people suddenly realize they are about to witness something completely unexpected. Dr. Vance stood up from the judging table, pushed his chair back, and walked slowly across the polished stage toward the whiteboard. Every single eye in the room followed his footsteps. Arthur had absolutely no choice. A legendary Princeton fellow had made a public, recorded request to examine a contestant's work. Refusing his request on camera would be a total admission that the council had something to hide from the international press. Arthur reluctantly stepped to the side, and the moment his body shifted away from the board, the absolute bottom right corner of the slate became fully visible to the front rows and the cameras. Dr. Vance began at line 1. He traced Nia's original proof with his index finger, moving methodically through the auxiliary network construction, the structural mapping between edge traces, and the highly original probabilistic counting argument she had invented on the spot. Each calculation step built perfectly on the last, clean, flawlessly logical, and entirely original. His finger reached the end of the main body of work, and then it moved down to the bottom right corner. He stopped. He read the final line of equations. He read it a second time, his eyes widening slightly behind his glasses. Then, he turned around slowly to face the quiet room. 5 seconds of absolute, suffocating silence passed. In those 5 seconds, the entire room was paralyzed by confusion. Bradley Chambers was frowning deeply at the floor. Arthur's forced smile was frozen on his face, like a brittle plastic mask that no longer fit his features. Maya had stopped breathing entirely. Nia had not moved an inch from her spot. 5 seconds felt like 5 hours. Then, Dr. Vance spoke clearly into the microphone. The proof is entirely complete. He pointed his finger directly at the bottom right corner of the board. The final completing line is right here, written precisely before the clock expired. He paused, turning to look at the blackboard one more time with immense professional respect. The structural bound is perfectly tight, the mapping method is entirely original, and it is, without a single question of doubt, the most elegant and brilliant piece of structural engineering math ever presented inside this institution. For one more second, the room remained completely still. One more second of 300 people processing what they had just heard. One more second of completely recalculating everything they thought they knew about the girl from the South Side. Then, the entire auditorium broke wide open. It didn't start with polite applause. It started with a loud, sharp gasp from a property developer in the third row, followed by a massive murmur that rippled outward like a tidal wave, and then came the clapping. It wasn't the restrained corporate applause from before. It was a deafening, thunderous roar that shook the high ceilings of the hall. Dozens of students stood up on their seats. The independent structural auditor in the front row covered her mouth with both hands in sheer disbelief. 2 of the junior professors on the judging panel started clapping enthusiastically before they had even fully processed the politics of what was happening. In the 5th row, Maya Dawson was sobbing openly, the tears streaming down her face. It was the kind of deep emotional release that comes from a place where every single insult, every dismissal, every closed door, and every racist whisper had been stored up and compressed for years, and was now being released all at once in a single moment of absolute validation. Bradley Chambers stared at the bottom right corner of the board for a long, agonizing time, his mouth slightly open. Then, he turned his head slowly to look at Nia. He didn't look angry, and he didn't look resentful. He looked like a man who had just watched someone perform a miracle he knew he could never replicate in his entire life. He began to clap his hands together. He was the first person standing in his row, cheering for her. Arthur Pendleton did not clap. He did not stand. He stood completely frozen at the side of the stage, his face gray, staring at the exact corner of the board he had spent the last 2 minutes trying to hide from the world. Whether he knew the final line was there when he stepped in front of it is a question that only his own conscience can answer. But 300 people in that room had just seen exactly where he had been standing, and 300 people would remember his shadow forever. Nia did not celebrate. She didn't pump her fist into the air. She didn't cheer, and she didn't cry. She simply closed her eyes for 2 seconds, taking a deep, quiet breath. When she opened them, she looked only at the whiteboard. She didn't look at the cheering audience. She didn't look at Arthur, and she didn't look at the flashing phone cameras. She looked only at her own handiwork, because the mathematics on that board was the only thing in that entire institution that had never lied to her. Dr. Vance turned sharply back to the judging table, his voice cutting through the fading noise. I move that this panel immediately reevaluate the semi-final grading data. Miss Vance's structural proof is not only mathematically complete, it is vastly superior to the textbook methods. Her approach is entirely original and far more applicable to real-world safety parameters. I further move that the overall competition trophy be awarded to her outright. There is absolutely nothing a further round could add to this demonstration. The remaining judges didn't hesitate. They voted 3-0, a unanimous decision. Nia Vance had officially won the Pendleton Structural Challenge. Bradley Chambers walked over and extended his hand to her. That auxiliary network shortcut was something I have never seen in any advanced text, he said quietly. Where did you learn that technique? Nia looked at his open hand, then up at his face. I didn't have access to your private seminar papers, she said calmly, so I had to build my own path from the ground up. Bradley paused for a moment, his voice dropping to a whisper. Your path was better. The room was still applauding, but the story was far from over. Dr. Marcus Vance wasn't finished with his duties, and he had one more piece of documentation to introduce to the floor. When he produced it, the applause stopped instantly, and the heavy silence that followed was the loudest sound that Grand Auditorium had ever heard. Nobody had left their seats. 300 people remained frozen, their phone cameras still out, red recording lights blinking across the dark rows like unblinking eyes. Dr. Vance walked to the absolute center of the stage, carrying 2 thick manila folders in his hands. Before we conclude this symposium, there is an official matter of institutional record that must be addressed immediately. His voice boomed through the speakers. The room went completely cold. He held up the first folder. The final competitive problem presented on this stage today has been officially traced to an unpublished private research manuscript authored by Professor Arthur Pendleton, dated exactly 6 months ago. The highly specific shortcut required to solve it was taught exclusively in his private, non-public seminar at Northwestern, accessible only to his hand-picked circle of students. He then held up the second folder, opening it to reveal a white sheet of paper. This is the original physical scoring sheet from round 2, filled out manually by the judging panel. Miss Vance's actual recorded score was a 98. The score that was deliberately announced and displayed on the digital screens to the public was a 91. He placed both folders down on the mahogany table with a heavy thud. This severe discrepancy has been officially documented and logged with the Federal Auditing Board. 300 heads turned in perfect unison to stare at Arthur Pendleton. Then the phones came up by the dozens. 100 red recording lights pointed directly at his face. The executive dean of the Architecture Council stood up from his seat in the 5th row, his face pale as he saw the press cameras flashing. He saw the investigative journalist from the Chicago Tribune furiously scribbling down every word. The Pendleton Distinguished Symposium is officially suspended, effective immediately, pending a full, independent review by the Office of Professional and Academic Integrity, the dean announced, his voice trembling slightly. Professor Pendleton, you are hereby relieved of all administrative duties, including your position as chairman of the Global Council, effective right now. He paused, clearing his throat nervously before looking toward the side of the stage. Additionally, I believe a formal public acknowledgement is owed to the winner of this challenge. Professor Pendleton, if you please. Every single lens in the room pointed at one man. Arthur stood at the podium, his hands trembling against the polished wood. His face had turned a completely hollow, ashen gray. He opened his mouth to speak, closed it, and then opened it again. The proud, untouchable king of the architecture board looked completely broken. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice sounding as though it were being extracted from his throat with rusted pliers, "I owe you a formal public apology. This competition should have been conducted with absolute fairness and transparency. It was not. That failure is entirely my responsibility." The words were agonizing for him to utter, but they were public. They were recorded on 100 devices, and they could never be unsaid or erased for the rest of his life. Within 6 hours of the final buzzer, the video of his public soup d'eau had accumulated over 2 million views online. By the following morning, the story of the rigged challenge had landed on the absolute front page of the Chicago Tribune, the New York Times, and CNN. 3 former minority students from his university department came forward to the press with similar, detailed accounts of institutional gatekeeping. His major textbook publisher immediately paused production on his upcoming manuals, and his international speaking invitations vanished from his calendar overnight. 60 years of inherited family prestige completely collapsed in less than 61 hours of public exposure. The council didn't officially fire him. They simply made him completely invisible. 2 days later, the grand auditorium was entirely empty. Nia came back to the hall one final time to collect a cheap blue notepad she had left behind near the front bench. The room was perfectly silent, the leather seats empty, and the stage lights were dimmed to a soft shadow. But the massive whiteboard was still standing at the center of the stage, and her brilliant structural proof was still written on it in clear white chalk. No one had dared to erase it. She wasn't entirely alone in the room. Arthur Pendleton was standing quietly in front of the board, not lecturing, not performing, and not wearing his gold-rimmed glasses. He was just standing there in the shadows, staring intensely at her work. His long career was in complete ruins. His family name had been stripped from the building, his grandfather helped design, and his private office had already been emptied into cardboard boxes. But none of that anger was on his face right now. He was just looking at the math. He heard the quiet sound of her work boots on the floor and turned his head slowly. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice entirely hollow, "the auxiliary network mapping. Where did you find that specific derivation?" Nia stopped near the edge of the stage, looking up at her own chalk lines. "I didn't find it anywhere, Professor," she said softly. "I told you before. I built it because I had to." A long, heavy pause followed her words. The longest and most profound silence between two people in this entire story. There were no flashing cameras, no critical audience, and no corporate performance left to give. It was just a man, a woman, and a flawless proof left on a board. "Yes," Arthur said, his voice barely a whisper as he turned back to face the slate. "I can see that now." It wasn't a forced, theatrical apology. The public apology had already been extracted from him on camera, and it had meant absolutely nothing to either of them. This was entirely different. This was a powerful man standing completely alone in the ruins of his ego, admitting to himself as much as to her that he had been entirely wrong about her worth. Nia Vance received her official letter of recommendation, fully reviewed and validated by an independent federal committee. She applied to 3 of the absolute top structural engineering doctoral programs in the country, and she was accepted to all 3 within a week. She chose to attend MIT, not the local institutions that had finally been forced to open their doors. She didn't choose the system that only let her in after a public scandal. She chose the one that recognized her talent from the very first page. On her long transit ride back to the South Side, she pulled out her phone and called Maya. "How does it feel to look at the acceptance letter?" Maya asked through the speaker, her voice filled with excitement. Nia looked out the window at the passing city skyline, a quiet smile appearing on her face. It feels like the heavy iron door was never actually locked, Nia said softly. We just couldn't see the handle in the dark. Real talk, this story hits completely different. Nia Vance didn't spend her time arguing on the internet, she didn't beg for their approval, and she didn't cry for a seat at their table. She simply showed up with a canvas backpack and let the absolute raw power of her work do all the talking. And the powerful man who tried so hard to erase her shadow from the board, everyone ended up staring directly at his instead. That is the beautiful thing about structural truth. You can try to block it with all the money and privilege in the world, but you are never going to stop it from rising. If this story reminded you of someone special, someone whose incredible talent the world hasn't had the chance to see yet, make sure you send this video to them right now. And if you want more deep, cinematic stories just like this one, make sure to hit that subscribe button immediately, because Nia Vance is not the last brilliant mind coming from the shadows. She is just the absolute beginning.